Kia ora, ngā mihi nui ki koutou katoa. Thank you very much, Dan and Dean, for your warm welcome. In fact, as I was listening to you, Dan, run through all of the challenges that are in front of us here, I thought I'll just let you do the whole speech. But really very grateful to the Bank of New Zealand for host BNZ for hosting us today. Also want to acknowledge my friend and colleague, Dr. Duncan Webb, who is the Minister of Commerce and Consumer Affairs, as I just said outside, is your go-to guy for all your regulatory concerns. Good to have Duncan here as well, and all of you, Raurangatira Mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Before I go any further, actually, I do want to acknowledge what Aucklanders and others around this region have been through in the last few days. The latest rain and flooding has just compounded the pain that the region was still feeling cleaning up from the anniversary weekend floods and Cyclone Gabrielle. And I know it's added significant stress to people at a very difficult time. And then we've also had the tragic death of Whangarei Boys High School pupil Kanan Ahurangi Petera. Our thoughts are with his family and friends. Moi mai rā. Following on from the deaths during the Auckland floods and Cyclone Gabrielle, it is a stark and tragic reminder of the impact of climate change and the resulting severe weather events can have on all of us. And it is those severe weather events that are a significant part of the backdrop to Budget 2023, along with the deteriorating global economy and high inflation driving cost of living pressures for so many New Zealanders. It's made for a very difficult set of decisions and trade-offs in Budget 2023. As Dan said, it's my sixth budget and they don't get any easier. In this context, Budget 2023 will have four themes. They are supporting New Zealanders with the cost of living, delivering the services that New Zealanders rely on, recovery and resilience, including economic resilience, and fiscal sustainability. Yesterday, I did a speech in Wellington which focused on fiscal sustainability, and today I mostly want to talk about the recovery and resilience theme. It's this theme that generates the greatest questions about the future of New Zealand's economy. How do we handle what the world and the weather and the ground beneath us throws at us with increasing frequency and intensity? How do we support businesses to be even more resilient, productive and innovative? Due to the significant scale of the recent events New Zealanders face, we've had to go considerably further than just the traditional emergency response framework to step up with greater support for businesses, communities and local government. Now, we've been able to do that because of the resilience of New Zealand's economy and because of the strength of the government's balance sheet. As a result, we are able both to step up to support New Zealanders through what we're facing in the here and now, while also being able to plan to build stronger foundations. The past 5.5 years have brought, in my opinion, some amazing progress for New Zealand despite all our challenges. We've supported low and middle income families and brought 77,000 children out of poverty. Wages have risen on average more than inflation. We've got record low unemployment, meaning more people than ever are engaged in work. We've secured new trade deals so that our program of free trade agreements covers nearly 3/4 of New Zealand's exports, up from less than half 6 years ago. Now, none of that takes away from the very challenging time being experienced by many New Zealanders, households and businesses. But it shows what we can do with our wellbeing approach and our careful management of the books. I take very seriously my role as the steward of New Zealand's public finances. To me, my job is to ensure that the government is always in a position to be able to provide adequate levels of services like healthcare and education and housing, and that we're in a position where we can invest in the infrastructure our economy and communities need to grow and prosper, and that we continuously support the most vulnerable in our society, which I believe the government has a moral obligation to do. It also means ensuring that the government can step up in times of need, that there is a buffer or capacity available to deal with the unexpected without having to drastically cut into services that New Zealanders rely on in their everyday lives. In recent years, various crises that you well know about have come to our shores and required us to step up and respond. When I do think back to the early days of COVID-19 and the decisions we had to make, faced with forecasts that the pandemic would kill thousands and bring the greatest global economic downturn since the Great Depression, I think about our response. It was no use preparing for a rainy day if when that day comes, you aren't prepared to put the umbrella up. And so we used the strength and resilience that we'd built into the government's balance sheet to ensure that New Zealand had the lowest excess mortality rate in the world, and provide confidence and cash flow to businesses affected by lockdowns and travel restrictions. And we have come out of the emergency COVID response with our economy more than 6% larger than before the pandemic in real terms. As I said, unemployment is near record lows. New Zealand is once again one of the most desirable places in the world for skilled people to come for work, according to the OECD. And we are seeing this confirmed now by record work visa numbers. We now had net migration at the end of February of 52,000. So those people are now coming back into our labour force. New Zealand also comes out of the pandemic with some of the lowest public debt in the world. Our net debt sits at around 19% of GDP, well below the 30% ceiling that we indicated when we set the fiscal rules last year. And it does continue to compare well to the countries that we like to compare ourselves to, such as Australia at 36%, the United Kingdom at 95% of GDP, and the United States at 96%. As I said, this is a rough time for many people, but I believe we're as well positioned as we can be to deal with it. So in Budget 2023, we are investing to support recovery and resilience, to deal with the here and now and the long term. The budget will provide further support towards the response to the anniversary weekend floods and the clean-up and recovery from Cyclone Gabrielle. This will build on the $889 million of support that we've already allocated. That support's gone to businesses, growers and farmers. It's supporting local councils, iwi and communities to clean up. It's providing temporary housing and accommodation. And we've also invested significantly in infrastructure rebuilds, including roads and rail. As many of you will know, earlier this week, Transport Minister Michael Wood announced Waka Putahi's decision to rebuild the crucial section of State Highway 25A to the Coromandel. As of the beginning of May, more than $80 million of the $215 million emergency works funding that we announced following Cyclone Gabrielle has been spent, with more ready to go. And interestingly, around 60% of that spend has actually been on local roads not owned by the government, and about 40% on state highways. Estimates from the Treasury have put the cost of asset damage alone from the floods and the cyclone at between $9 and $14.5 billion. I can assure you that's not how I was planning this year to go. Half of this cost estimate relates to public infrastructure. That's the assets owned by central and local government, like roads and rail, bridges and stockpiles. Infrastructure like schools, which as we know often act as a community hub during times of crisis, also took a battering, along with our health facilities. I'll have more to say about our ongoing response on Sunday as we continue the rolling wall of response and recovery support funded by the government, with a focus on public infrastructure. Now, this won't be the end of the government stepping up to help impacted communities. We're working with regional recovery agencies as they develop their regional recovery plans. We've been working with banks, including the BNZ and insurance companies, to ensure that our response remains coordinated and that we are all part of finding the solutions for businesses. And we're assessing how we can further support severely impacted sectors, such as the horticulture industry, to rebuild. Now that work will take a little more time, but we do recognise the urgency in giving certainty of the government's commitment. And I can say for sure that we are in this for the long haul as a partner. But I do need to make something else clear. Central government alone cannot take on all the costs that are faced in this recovery and rebuild. We have been taking on the majority of the initial response costs because that's the right and necessary thing to do, and our resilient position has allowed us to do that. As we've shown during previous crises, it was important that we put support in place to quickly provide cash flow and confidence in the immediate aftermath of this natural disaster. As we move to the rebuild phase and consider the future of severely affected land following the floods, hard calls are going to need to be made by central government, by local government, commercial businesses, communities, banks and insurance companies. It will require a partnership for making decisions and for how we finance those decisions. Last month, the Prime Minister announced that we would pay the government share of response and recovery costs through our annual allowances that we set ourselves each year to control spending. That has required prioritisation and tough decisions during the Budget 2023 process. Yesterday, I outlined how the government had identified $4 billion worth of savings and reprioritisations over the next 4 years, which are now available to go towards more pressing priorities. This will help us build back stronger and more resilient infrastructure to support regions affected by the cyclone and the sectors which operate in them. Budget 2023 will also invest so that we can plan ahead, to be more secure in the face of whatever the world will next throw at us, while growing a higher wage, lower emission economy. And this will include investment in skills, research and innovation, and infrastructure. Infrastructure investment will be critical to both the rebuild from these recent events and to our future growth, economic growth and security. And it'll build on the tens of billions of dollars we've invested in recent years. But again, we have to recognise our context. New Zealand has an extraordinary infrastructure deficit. Treasury's investment statement last year estimated the cost of addressing that deficit and stopping it getting worse at $210 billion over the next 30 years. Decades of failing to maintain and enhance our infrastructure have been exacerbated by failing to plan and build for population growth. And on top of that, we're acutely aware that the infrastructure that we do invest in needs to be resilient to the ever more obvious impacts of climate change. There is no point building back from the weather events of recent years in just the same way when we know we'll be experiencing more of them into the future. Build Back Better is not an empty slogan when it comes to the way we have to develop our infrastructure. It's an integral and critical approach. We've achieved significant progress with our National Adaptation Plan, and work is underway on adaptation legislation. Work's begun to develop principles and frameworks for how we might confront and decide land use changes due to rising sea levels and flooding risks. In response to the anniversary weekend floods and Cyclone Gabrielle, that policy work has moved very quickly to become about practical implementation. And we're in the middle of it as we speak. Yesterday, I set out how we're progressing land use decisions in the most affected regions following the recent flooding. And that includes timelines for decision making and engaging with communities on next steps. I want to acknowledge that for many affected communities, including people here in Auckland, they are desperate for certainty on the next steps. And we are working as fast as we can with councils and insurers to get the data we have thoroughly checked to make sure that those next steps are the right steps. It is our job to plan ahead and build future resilience into our national infrastructure network to protect and grow our economy. And it's crucial that we continue to lift investment around the country to close the infrastructure deficit I've mentioned. I also believe it's crucial that New Zealanders are given certainty that their government has the ability to make those investments. And that requires strong and resilient finances. Break for political comment. Now is not the time to be putting that resilience at risk by undermining the government's fiscal position with unfunded inflationary tax cuts. They would take money away from the government's ability to step up and support communities by planning ahead. What I can tell you today is that on budget day, the government will be taking further steps to fund investment in the infrastructure bill, following on from the cyclones and floods, and importantly, looking towards future national resilience projects to provide greater protection to communities around the country from the increased risks that they face. I won't say much more about the funding today, other than to say that it will be a down payment on making sure our nationally strategic infrastructure is strong and resilient. It will be a concrete commitment that we cannot just kick the can down the road when it comes to creating the building blocks for a stronger and more resilient economy and a more connected and inclusive society. So while we will build back better, stronger and smarter from Gabrielle, our job is to step up and make sure we're building stronger and smarter resilience into all parts of the country which are at risk from the greater number of weather events and natural disasters. There are practical things we can do here. To give you just one example, in addition to the funding that we're able to contribute from the budget allowances to strategic infrastructure and the cyclone rebuild, Transport Minister Michael Wood has been working with Waka Kotahi on a program of regional resilience investments for our transport network. This is what they call the invisible component of our transport network: culverts, slip protections and water pumps. This work is funded separately from the annual road maintenance budgets due to its importance and in order to give confidence to our regions that the funding is there and ready to be deployed. It will be ongoing work identifying and prioritising these projects, with an initial set of projects to be announced through the budget. So in conclusion, these investments build our economic resilience and they are an example of our wellbeing approach in action. I do believe that we have a moral obligation to every New Zealander and every region to help protect and strengthen their infrastructure, physical and social. This is actually intergenerational focus that is core to our wellbeing work. There's an obligation to plan ahead and to plan for resilience. We can do that because we have one of the strongest and most resilient balance sheets in the world. That's why a key focus of Budget 2023 is fiscal sustainability, because we have to continue to ensure that we can invest in a resilient economy and support people as they recover. We have to cut our cloth, and that's why we prioritise spending, and they have been tough decisions. We also have to balance that against the other two themes that I mentioned at the start of my speech: easing the pressure of cost of living and funding our core services. So there are trade-offs. We have deferred projects that meant a lot to many people, ministers and others in the community. But that's the right thing to do in today's economic and weather climate. We will support New Zealanders in the here and now against what's been thrown at us from a volatile world and extreme weather, while also making sure that we invest in a better tomorrow. That is what I believe a responsible government must do, and it's what you will see in Budget 2023. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you, Minister. I don't think he needs my assistance for a Q&A because it's very tightly packed group, so it's a bit odd. But I think probably about 10 or so minutes if we've got some questions. We'll just do a quick fire. Is that fine?
Quick one, so thank you for putting some more definition around Build Back Better, because I think we're in danger of people having sort of diverse definitions of what that means. I'll just give you one example. I'm on the board of Build. We're thinking about our West Coast communities that we've cut off. There's vegetation taking down power lines. For some, Build Back Better is let's underground the power all the way up to those communities. The bill for that would be astronomical. We need to think differently. It might be, we don't know the answer, it might be better that we invest to make them resilient and have their own power source in those communities so that they can be standalone and totally protected from everything that goes on around them. So it's about thinking differently. And Build Back Better is often, I'm hearing people talking about, in my words, build back gold-plated, and we must not fall for that trap.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, I'll leave you and Mike to debate the wisdom of how power lines get from one place to the other. But I think your overall point is a really good one, and it is important. I guess 2 or 3 things jump into my mind. One of those is, as I said here, there are some very practical things you can do to make that make that work that are not seen by people, but actually will make a big difference. The second thing is that there are many different types of resilience building. And one of the things that's happened is the conversations ended up being about mandatory treatment, because that's such a big and serious part of resilience, the idea that you would work with a community to say, you can't stay here, you have to completely move away. That's such a dramatic thing, and it is a conversation that we need to be having with some communities around the country. But there are so many other forms of resilience that are also possible, and without getting too deeply into the detail, the work we're doing at the moment with Brian Roach and the task force working with councils and insurers is categorising properties, and there's a category in the middle which is category 2, which is all about what can you do to make sure you don't have to live. And these are those kinds of, as you say, thinking differently. Third thing I would say, just to reiterate what's in what I said in the speech, is that this has to be a partnership. I think about yourselves in the energy companies and the electricity transmission area. I think about the work that we've got to do in water, obviously. Broader telecommunications. You know, we had some issues in the early days of this particular situation. Public infrastructure, which is by and large what that is. That's where we definitely come in. There's a lot of other things that have to happen that have got to be a partnership with banks and others as well. So thank you for your definitely an issue. So thank you for making that point, and we'll continue to fill out that definition as we move forward.
Just a comment on that, Catherine Wilson, Property Council New Zealand. We've had our Green Property Summit 2 days ago, where one of the themes was the most sustainable building is one that is built today. And so when we're talking about Build Back Better as well, it should be also around retrofitting and environmentally and intensification there, CBD or key transport nodes to support more resilient infrastructure.
As you know, you'll never get an argument from me around the intensification. Perhaps there's some other stakeholders I need to chair with. But yeah, I mean, the way we build is a very, very significant part of the way this will, the Build Back Better approach will happen. And the way we, as you say, the way we built maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago isn't necessarily going to be the appropriate one now. I think probably the most challenging aspect of this is the pace at which we can make decisions. Because if it's you and your house and your family and your business, you want that decision right now. And our issue is we have to be able to support not just the quick decision, but the right decision, because it has such consequences. And it's not just the communities affected by this, it's every community in New Zealand, essentially, because over time, with the rise in extreme weather events, we're all going to be impacted in some form or other. And so knowing the precedent, understanding the moral hazards, these are all part of the decision making tree that we've got. So we're working as fast as we can on it, involving as many people as we can, but they're very consequential decisions.
Minister, one of the things that we've been talking to the government about is something like accelerated depreciation to encourage businesses to invest in new technology and also to decarbonise. Your views on that?
Yeah, and obviously it's an idea that's floated around often, and in the work that we're currently doing looking at sectors in the Hawke's Bay, it's come up again, particularly in the horticulture sector. I'm certainly not taking it off the table, but immediately it's not a decision we're making. What I'd invite people to do, and it's quite an interesting piece of work, which is the work that Queensland did in the wake of their floods, and they ended up with the creation of the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. And what that did was build in a whole series of different ways in which support could be created. And there's some quite innovative things there, including, if there's going to be support for somebody to move or to rebuild, that rebuild must enhance the resilience. That actually can't just go from work. So there's some quite interesting ideas that we've been looking at in Queensland. But yeah, accelerated depreciation, it's got a bill and a cost for the government, but it is something that is being brought forward to us in this context.
Grant, I'm not RMA grumpy.
Go on, ask a question about the RMA.
No, it's more around the scale of what you're talking about in terms of expenditure, and we've seen false starts from government in the past where they set out an ambition, there's an enormous scale, and then they say they get confused about the implementation model. Are you prepared to work with the big end of town, the Fletchers in the room, to make this actually happen through the very scarce competence and capability that we have in this country?
Yeah, the short answer to the question is yes. But you do raise an extremely important point, and the Infrastructure Commission, when they produced their work for the strategy, made very clear that buying our way out of this was not going to work. I mean, I mentioned the $210 billion Treasury estimate. We do need to invest more money, so we can't not invest more money, but the scale of what we'd be required to invest to do it is just not possible for a government. So two things are there. How do we better use the infrastructure that we've got? And there is a lot of things that we can do there, I think, that help us. But secondly, who else do we work with to take implementation, financing, all of that forward? And we've tried to put in place some building blocks for that, things like the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act and so on. But I recognise there's likely to need to be more done in that space. The other element, though, that you hit on is literal capacity. And I need to make it very, very clear, we're going to be investing money, but the actual spend of that money will be spread over some considerable time, partly because of capacity, because we just don't have it. One of the things I would really like out of the work that we're doing, we're going to be about this in the next few minutes, but one of the things we really want to do out of the work that the Infrastructure Commission has done is confirm the strategy and confirm the pipeline and try to get that as something that doesn't fall victim to changes of government whenever they do occur. And that's hard work, because we're not always going to exactly agree on a particular infrastructure project. But if we can provide certainty about the pipeline, more players will will choose to be involved. And we do have a risk in New Zealand that at large scale infrastructure, there's only a very few people who can take that on. And that's for our country isn't good enough. So we've got conversations we need to have about how we deal with that internally, how we work with Australia, because they obviously are larger, often working in similar spaces. How do we look at that in terms of who's in our region and available to lead that work? And on the financing side, absolutely happy to do that, but we've got to get on top of our strategy and our implementation plan for infrastructure, which I don't think we've done in New Zealand. One of the things that unfortunately crises like the cyclone help us to do is bring central and local government together a bit better on that, because we haven't always helped in terms of the certainty for the sector, because we've both been going off doing things without them being that well coordinated. So I think all of that can come together. So yeah, that's a longer version of the short answer.
You mentioned that one of the things the budget center addresses support around cost of living challenges, and obviously that's a topic we'll cover later. But inherent in that is the challenge that if you fuel too much consumption and demand, then it perpetuates the issue. So you must have made some assumptions around inflation, and I'm just keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Risky business for the Minister of Finance to share his assumptions around inflation. The data around all of that will be in the budget, and I won't preempt what it says. You can read what your own forecasters and others are saying, and inflation, most of them believe has peaked, and we're on our way down from there. How quickly is the big question, and when I saw the food price information yesterday, it really indicates to us particularly the impact of the weather. And that's something that's a bit unique to New Zealand in terms of this part of the cycle. So there are forces there. On the other side, we're starting to see the labour supply constraints we have come off. So there's a lot of countervailing forces there. But as I say, you'll be able to read about where the Treasury think that is. In terms of the first part of what you said, though, I do think it's a very important point. I mentioned it briefly in my political interlude in the speech, that going forward from here, yes, we have to continue to ease cost of living pressures, but we must not do that in a way that exacerbates the current inflationary pressures and makes the very problem we're trying to solve worse. And so you would have seen in 1st of April we had a range of quite significant supports to people on low and middle incomes, superannuitants, and we want to track forward in the budget targeted and focused ways of easing the cost of living pressure. And so it's a very challenging balancing act. It is one of the biggest challenges we've got as to how we can do that. How, if we are going to invest more, it's productive and doesn't do that. So things like infrastructure investment are spread over a long period of time and do have those long-term productivity benefits. And so you can look at that as being an area where we want to spend more money, and we've highlighted myself today and the Prime Minister previously that will be a focus in the budget. But it is constantly on our mind. The thing about inflation is its most pernicious impact is on those who can least afford it. And that's the thing that we always have to bear in mind when we're trying to solve
The events of floods and cyclone create a whole bunch of costs that don't appear on your the impact on family community that helps for one period of time. The carbon costs of floods, which in the UK they estimate about £40 per house of flooded. Where's the living standards framework in terms of how we incorporate those types of considerations?
Terrific question, and I was hoping Matt would ask a question so I could embarrass him and say that I do want to acknowledge your announcement, Matt, of recent days that you'll be moving on, and thank you for the great work you've done in leading the super fund. So I do genuinely want to do that. Funnily enough, without giving the budget away, there is a page in the budget on exactly this point, on what are the impacts from the extreme weather events analysed against our wellbeing framework. So folks will know that our wellbeing framework looks at things around 4 broad kind of areas: people, communities, the environment, and finances. And so we've actually done exactly the exercise that you've mentioned, Matt, to try and say, well, how does this work? And that has influenced us in terms of our response. So it would be all very well for me to say it's just roads and rail and that's all we're going to do, but it isn't. It is the schools and it is the hospitals and it's very much housing and accommodation. And so we have absolutely used the framework to say, what are these impacts? Beyond that, it's ongoing mental health impacts. And I mentioned this yesterday in my speech, and I'll do it again today, that we, for all of the pride I have in how we got through COVID and how we continue to support people, and the big numbers look good for New Zealand compared to the rest of the world, that can mask big impacts like the ones that you're talking about. And I mentioned a person I'd seen recently who had really struggled but got through COVID, a small business person who got through COVID, and then they got whacked by Cyclone Gabrielle. And you know, there's only so much stoicism people have got. And I mentioned yesterday that I think we've all got a collective obligation to look after the people around us. The 1737 helpline is available to everybody who's got mental health concerns. And I think we've all got an obligation to talk to the people around us. And I want to make an acknowledgement of Auckland Chamber and EMA, who we worked with to develop the First Steps program, which is available for people to use. And Michael, after I mentioned it yesterday in my speech, Michael was quickly on the phone to indicate that he's off to Europe, I think, to talk about it, because it's a program that's got real interest internationally about how small business people can be looked after and supported in these environments. So that's a good example of the toll that this can take. And absolutely, you know, I remain 100% committed to our wellbeing approach. It was pretty challenging in 2020, 21 and 22 as we were dealing with COVID, and we applied the wellbeing approach, but the actual work within the budget just had to kind of focus there. We've done that again. The way we assess the projects that come in is on a wellbeing value for money basis. And we continue to try to make sure that's at the core of what we do, but I think it's an extremely, extremely good point. And then obviously the ultimate end of that is the tragedy of loss of life. And we've seen that in the cyclone and in the recent weather events as well.
You're aware of the concerns around safety, and we've been looking obviously at the role of police, but also other agencies. Does the budget reflect some of these concerns?
Yeah, so it's a good chance to talk about another element of our wellbeing approach, which is multi-year funding. And so last year, for the first time, we trialled multi-year funding approaches. So one of the great frustrations of ministers of finance days gone by, and myself as well, is the very annualised, siloed nature of the way government budgets work. And so part of what I've been trying to do as finance minister is make some changes there. And the ones we did last year, we trialled two clusters of agencies to come together. One of those was the Justice Stream. And the trade-off for all those agencies coming together and coming up with one plan was that they got 3 years of funding. And so that we're now in the second year of that funding rolling out. One of the good things is that it was great to see, so that essentially that's police, justice, courts, corrections, all coming together. Oranga Tamariki is part of it as well. And they came up with a very clear sheet of goals, which essentially was about stopping the pipeline of people coming in to the criminal justice system and how you can work with them. They also have the ability to move funding around within the allocation that we've given them, and they've already done that by, for example, looking more at retail crime than they previously had. So you can expect to see that continue. It's substantial sums of money, and then from time to time, obviously we have to deal with new things that emerge and add to that. So you certainly will see the further rollout of those 3 years of funding, but there won't be new funding because they got their funding last year.
Probably time for one more.
I'll take two for time. Connor's going to ask me about rugby leagues.
I'm not going to ask you about rugby. Just thinking, come back to infrastructure, interested in your comments on port resilience, ports. And I'm interested in your comments on sort of total capacity, you know, thinking about a port like Tauranga, which is bumping up against these issues, but also resilience of ports and the interoperability and the way that ports work together. I think we've seen during Gabrielle at a relatively modest scale how that's important, but interested if you're...
Yeah, and I was pleased to be in Tauranga the other day and sit down with the the grouping that's been brought together around Western Bay of Plenty infrastructure, which obviously centres around the port, and very well aware of the port's expansion desires, and don't want to comment on that as a before the port. But more broadly, I've been a long-term fan of a nationwide port strategy. That is, as you well know, is a very, very challenging undertaking given the ownership structures of the ports that we have in New Zealand. So I tend to think of it more as a supply chain strategy. And I certainly think in the Upper North Island there's a lot more that we can do to get that to be an integrated thing. So we are working on that, and the Minister of Transport is very, very well aware of the importance of getting that right. I think in terms of your other point, we've certainly seen in the response to this the role of coastal shipping, and I think that is a massive part of our transport resilience picture. The fact that we were able to stand up relatively quickly because the Napier run saved a couple of businesses, I think, and kept that very, very important pipeline going. Having options, having resilience is important. There's a bit of work to do, more close to hand with Coromandel and elsewhere to make sure that we also find ways to do that. So we put some money in last year's budget specifically into a coastal shipping strategy, and we've been using that through this. But I agree with you, it's critical. I will pause my answer there and not talk about the Auckland Port.
My question is about some of the long-term thinking that the government has done. It seems like we're having to do that all the time with climate change and resilience and things. Prior to all of this, some of the long-term thinking we're doing around the future of work is leading to the income insurance scheme and where that is at. And I understand there's obviously part why you dealt with all these other things, but where do you think that kind of work, the necessity for that kind of work needs to go?
Yeah, it certainly hasn't gone away. So the Future of Work Forum, which for those who don't know brings together business, unions and government, and more recently iwi, together to talk about what are the big challenges in the world of work and how do we go about addressing them. It's still very much operating. We had a terrific forum the other day on women and work and the things that we can do to potentially support women to stay in the workforce. So those issues are still there. I think I guess one of the big challenges for us, and one of the things that's on my mind whenever I think about that future of work issue is the centrality of skills and training within what we do, and the way in which we have to continue to keep building that within what we do, but keep it as nimble and as flexible as we can. So of course we are who we are. We took on massive things like the reorganisation of our vocational training sector, and those things are works in progress to get going. So there's some newer things, but there are some very core things that we've got to make sure that we get right. Access to technology remains a really important part of that as well. Within our digital strategy, which emerged out of the Future of Work Forum, digital inclusion is one of the biggest barriers to people achieving their potential, and so we want to make sure that we are working on that. So we'll do, if we're given the privilege of governing again, we'll do a refresh of that Future of Work Forum to make sure we are on those issues. But it remains absolutely critical to be able to look ahead and develop the workforce that we need.
Great. Thank you, Minister. Thank you so much for that, and thank you all for coming out this morning. So I really appreciated those comments and the ability to have a bit of an extended question period, so thank you for that, and thank you for joining us, Mr. Webb. So, look, that concludes us today. I'd like to make your way before
Just hang on there, just in case our camera broke out.
Sorry.
Not quite.
Hold your horses.
Not quite there.
But I will.
What sort of scale are we talking about for these regional resilience funds?
As I said, I'll have more to say in the budget around the scale of our investment. It will have to be ongoing, is the first thing. So whatever I might announce on budget day will never be the end of the road here, given the scale of what I mentioned before. What I think is really important, and I did mention this yesterday, is that the way we use our balance sheet to help do that. And last year I did make some changes around the fiscal rules to enable us, where appropriate, to use our balance sheet to help make a dent in the big infrastructure deficit. So I'll get into the detail of that next Thursday.
So you're saying that these funds will be funded from debt rather than from the reallocation of operating funds that we talked about?
Again, I won't get into the detail of it today, but it's a package. So there's always within a budget an element of things that are to do with reallocation, there's an element of things that are to do with debt, revenue. And so all of that comes together, but as I said, I've made the point in the past that I think our balance sheet could be used better.
Minister, you mentioned you're 100% committed to the wellbeing approach. What does that tangibly mean? I mean, ruling out a CGT and a wealth tax. What are you doing to resume that focus on the wellbeing economy?
Well, I'd argue that we haven't taken our focus away from that. I mean, the work that we've done over the last few years, for example, to lift the incomes of low-income New Zealanders has been significant. You know, when you look at families who rely on income support, solo parents, about $175 a week better off. So we can deliver in that way. What the wellbeing approach asks us to do really importantly is look at generations. And so we do that through a variety of things, like an investment in infrastructure, like the reorganisation of the health system. So it doesn't have to rely on a particular tax change.
You met with Catherine Trebeck this week from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and she said there's been a backsliding since Chris Hipkins took the leadership and since Jacinda Ardern's wellbeing budget of 2019. You disagree? There's been a backsliding?
I met with Catherine and we had that discussion. I think she also made the point, I saw in one interview, that clearly when COVID came along, some of the structural things we wanted to do around the wellbeing approach, we weren't able to take forward as much. As I said when I spoke today, I'd argue that we adopted a wellbeing view of how to deal with COVID. You know, go hard, go really, support the health response for a good economic response. They're all the way a wellbeing approach should work. What Catherine's looking for is some of the big kind of systematic shifts, and I get that. I think things like the health sector reform are a good example. These things build up over time, and I think it's great that people like Catherine and the Wellbeing Alliance are there to push us all along. And we had a great conversation actually about where we can go. As it happens, I think you can check with her, but I think we both agreed at the end that you used the phrase bread and butter, that's the Prime Minister's phrase. Actually, that is wellbeing as well. It's about making sure that the core elements of what give people a good life are there in place.
Minister, a report from Consumer New Zealand this morning found that 39% of New Zealanders just do not trust banks. What does that say to you?
I think you need to ask the banks that question. Look, you know, New Zealand has a stable financial system, and I think that's something that we should be pleased about. It's certainly helped us a lot as we've gone through crises like COVID. But that doesn't mean that everything's perfect. It doesn't mean that we're all in absolute agreement about where banks, you know, or other financial institutions might be. So we continue to try to make sure that we put in place the regulations that Dr. Webb's in charge of, but make sure we've got a robust system. Do you want to say anything more about that?
I think you've covered it. All we can say at the moment.
Do you trust banks?
Do I trust banks? I actually do trust banks. I mean, there is a debate to be had about profits. There's a debate to be had about the way in which a individual consumer might have an experience with a bank. But overall, do I trust them? Do I think that they're doing their job? And do I think that our financial system is stable? Then yes, I do.
So you don't think they're making too much money?
To be speaking in a bank on the same day that survey shows?
Well, obviously the survey and me speaking here are not related to each other. We need banks.
Do you think they make too much money?
I'll carry on. We need banks. Banks are part of the system in the way in which we work. On any given day, there may be concerns about that. And as I say, they should be concerns that the banks respond to. When it comes to levels of bank profit, I've said many times, banks have to justify, particularly in difficult economic circumstances, the level of profits that they have in order to keep their social licence. I haven't read the report, so I don't know how much profits feed in people's view about trust, but those issues are definitely ones they have to justify.
Do you think should we look out for a bank market study or an insurance market study on the Labour manifesto?
Dr. Webb and myself have both recently made the point that decisions about that are coming to Cabinet very soon about where the next market study will go. I think the Prime Minister said on Monday that, if I quote him directly, that the idea of one into banks is not off the table.
And in terms of a funding infrastructure or long-term funding infrastructure, do you have a plan in place if there is a change of government?
Yeah, I talked about that today, which is that we created the Infrastructure Commission, and their first and biggest job was to create an infrastructure strategy, and they've done that. I personally believe that's a strategy that could be embraced by any party. It certainly has been by us, and you can ask the other parties if they are interested in doing that. I hope they are, because it does give you the base for something that means we don't at least have dramatic shifts in what our priorities are. The next step from that then is a prioritised action plan, and the government has one of those as well. I also think that by and large would be something that could be supported across the board, although you can never get past the fact that parties might have a different view on a particular project. But that is a very important piece of work for me, that we do give that level of certainty for communities, but also for the people who actually do the work and do the building. And as I said earlier, I'd love us to have a greater level of competition within the big infrastructure end, because otherwise New Zealanders are perhaps not getting all the value for money they might.
You talked about some of the fiscal rules, around debt and things like that, and we've always talked about saving for a rainy day. So I guess the implication of that is that the natural sort of fiscal ceiling might be even lower than sort of 30% of debt. So what is, I guess, the real sort of debt percentage that you think that the Crown should be kind of carrying?
One of the things I want to get away from is targeting a percentage. I think that's actually was part of the issue, and we did it. We did it when we came into government, and my reflection on being in government is that slavishly striving towards a particular percentage target means you aren't necessarily responding to the circumstances around us. Hence why last year we went for the approach of a ceiling. Now we're well below that ceiling at the moment, but you're making the very point. The buffer, the capacity is important, and so I'm comfortable with the track that we're on, but I'm also making the point we can use that balance sheet to do long-term investment, and as I say, I have a bit more to say about that.
Isn't this the rainy day? People are saving for when they save for a rainy day?
Bernard, it's been pouring down for a few years. That's the problem, and so we've certainly have, and we've spent significant sums of money. I get criticised about that often, because we did invest to make sure that we got New Zealand through COVID with one of the lowest, if not the lowest, excess mortality rate in the world, and with the economy and businesses surviving. So we have spent for the rainy day, and the point I'm making here is in another way, which is less operational and more long-term infrastructure, we can do similarly.
Do you think, though, that the current 30% ceiling is appropriate for a population that's currently growing at 2% per year, and the current plans are only for 0.5% population growth per year, and also with climate change and intergenerational wealth issues, is that 30% high enough? Because that's sort of business as usual, but these structural changes, shouldn't it be much higher?
Two different 30% I think we're talking about here.
Both the early 30s for tax and revenue, but also
for
the ceiling for
I'm very comfortable with the ceiling, because I do think that for a small open economy that is susceptible to natural disasters, it is important that we manage that carefully. And as I said before, we're at 19. So there is headroom for us to be able to both have capacity and store when things come along, but also to think about how we build our long-term infrastructure. Of course, there'll be an argument from some people that we can do more, but I'm happy with that balance.
So what about the 2% population growth?
Yeah, as I said, we have to start building that in, but I don't think we can do that within those fiscal rules.
You spoke about nationally significant infrastructure. This is going to be costly. Is this just going to come out of the Cyclone Recovery Fund, or are we looking beyond that?
there isn't really a cyclone recovery fund per se. What I said in the speech and what I'll talk about more is that I do think we obviously have an initial set of infrastructure work that desperately needs to be done in response to the cyclone and the anniversary weekend floods. But we've also got to start to look beyond that to a broader sense of resilience. And that is going to be felt, those impacts of climate change and weather events and other shocks are felt right around New Zealand. And so we also have to be looking to that. But clearly our initial focus is on the severely impacted areas that we've got.
And would you be able to expand on, you talked about local and central government working together. Are you able to talk a little bit more about that?
Well, we're doing it right now. So the work that we're doing at the moment around severely affected areas, what happens with issues like managed retreat, local government's absolutely critical to that. They ultimately make the land use decisions that this involves. What we've tried to do as central government is support a locally led recovery, bring the insurers to the table so we're getting one set of understandings about what the risks are and what that means. Then when it comes to the next phases, local government clearly has a very important role to play in building up infrastructure. Many of the infrastructure that was affected during the cyclone was theirs, not ours. And so we have a partnership to work together. That's challenging, particularly perhaps a little less so here in Auckland, but if you're a small unitary authority like the Gisborne District Council, it's tough going to be able to do all that investment. So we're continuing to talk about what we can do to help.
So is it appropriate for the Auckland Council, in response to the floods and the extra costs around COVID, to cut spending on social services and try to sell assets rather than use their balance sheet like the government did?
Well, to answer that, you've answered the question yourself at the end there. I mean, the government has taken the approach we've taken. It is up to the Mayor and to Auckland City to make their decisions, and Auckland City residents, ratepayers will judge there. One thing I would say there is we are looking for a partnership here as we move forward, and we've had some very successful partnerships in Auckland around things like HATAP and the housing program where we've worked really well together, so we want to keep doing that.
Will New Zealand ever be able to call itself a wellbeing economy rather than what you say a wellbeing approach? Because as you say, that's huge structural change that requires.
I'm very pleased you're getting into this, by the way, because I think it's really important. We always said from the beginning that this would be a long-term process. So to give you an example, we set 5 wellbeing objectives back in the first wellbeing budget in 2019, and we said they would endure because they were the big issues around things like mental health, child wellbeing, Māori and Pacific aspirations, because we knew they'd take a long time. But by setting them up, putting them into every budget, we then guide ourselves on getting there. It's a long, long process to do that, but I remain very proud of the fact we've done it. We're breaking new ground, so we have to try things that other countries haven't even had a look at yet. I mentioned before the multi-year funding thing, bringing agencies together so that we actually look at objectives in the long term. You know, we're shifting maybe 30 plus years of the way the public sector's worked. That's not as easy as it might sound, but I am proud of what we've achieved, acknowledging that there's much more. Let's take a couple more.
But aren't you making short-term decisions around things like the emissions trading scheme, which are in the long run, are going to mean we have higher emissions and therefore there are wellbeing liabilities?
Within what we've done in the last few years and what you will see in the budget on Thursday, significant work to meet our emissions reduction plan and our carbon budgets. Just because there are a couple of projects which the government considered right now weren't in a position to be able to be implemented and actually weren't going to help us in over the next few years in the way that we'd hoped, doesn't take away from what we're doing. It's always a balance. It's always a need to make sure we look after people in the here and now using a wellbeing approach whilst also doing those long-term things. But our commitment to those climate goals has not altered, and we have made significant investments and we will make further.
So if New Zealand tips into a recession, are you going to make any change?
To
just the way you spend or your budget?
Again, I'm not getting into any of the fiscal and economic forecasts in advance of the budget. We'll be able to discuss those then. But clearly, when we put our budgets together, we take into account the economic conditions. That's the whole point.
Can I ask you about teachers? And sorry if you mentioned this yesterday, but are you putting more money aside to pay these teachers?
Oh look, we're in negotiations, and so I'm not going to get into individual amounts of money or anything like that. We want to be able to settle with our teachers. It's important for parents, it's important for the students, and it's important for teachers. And so those negotiations are ongoing. We have increased wages for teachers over the time we've been in government, and we want to keep talking about how we can make their working environment the best it can possibly be.
Will this budget represent a tightening of fiscal policy or a loosening of fiscal policy? Because you talked about no frills and finding $4 billion of saving elsewhere. That sounds like a tighter setting.
Again, we'll come back to all of that next week, but it's a balance. It's a balance with dealing with unexpected expenditure that we have to have, like on cyclones, with long-term issues that we have to deal with as well. But we'll get into that next week.
It sounds like
we'll take one more.
The stronger than expected migration flows. Theoretically, they're bringing in more tax revenue. That should be able to support a bigger infrastructure spend or a bigger spend in the future. Is it going to?
I'll get you to sit down with the Treasury economist, because it's a bit of a dollar each way here, which is that yes, it does. That immigration generally does increase GDP essentially. What it also does is increase some of the other costs that we have in the economy, and as I've mentioned before, I don't think we've planned properly for that in the past. So it certainly helps, I think, net. But yeah, I can get a briefing out of the Treasury economist, because there's always the costs associated with it.
I guess they're bringing in, they'll be paying taxes. There's more taxes, bringing more taxes than you may have expected.
Yeah.
So does that support a greater infrastructure spend, for example?
Well, I think it's mutually reinforcing, isn't it? Because we need the greater infrastructure spend, as Ben has been putting out in his questions for population. Sorry, folks, I've got to get up to another meeting.